Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like or subscribe to Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. Now I know I promised you a break over the summer, but hydrogen has become such a hot topic I couldn't possibly take off to the mountains without talking about it. This week's episode is brought to you courtesy of BloombergNEF. It's the first instalment of the two-part blog I wrote a few months ago, entitled Separating Hype from Hydrogen. Today we're going to focus on the supply side, and next week I'll read the second part of that blog dealing with the demand side. Between these two episodes, I hope I can help you figure out what hydrogen really can contribute to the clean energy and transport transition and what it can't. Let's start with a brief history of hydrogen hype cycles. Then we'll look at the EU's hydrogen strategy, part of its Green Deal, and then dive into the full colour chart of different sorts of clean hydrogen, starting with green hydrogen. That's hydrogen made via electrolysis using renewable electricity. Next, we'll plunge into blue hydrogen. That's hydrogen made from fossil fuels, but with the emitted CO2 captured and stored so it doesn't contribute to climate change. Then we'll dip into pink hydrogen. That's hydrogen made with nuclear electricity, and turquoise hydrogen from biomass. Finally, because there's so much talk of importing hydrogen from places where it can be cheaply made, we'll take a look at hydrogen transport costs too. So, let's get started. When Ahmed Sheikh Yamani, Saudi's oil minister during the oil shocks of the 1970s and 80s, famously said that, quote, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil," he was not thinking of renewable energy and electric vehicles, he was thinking of hydrogen. On the surface, the most common element in the universe seems like the answer to every energy question. It can be produced anywhere you have electricity and water. It can generate either heat or electricity. It can be produced, stored, transported and used without toxic pollution or CO2 emissions. It carries 3 times as much energy per unit weight as petrol, diesel or jet fuel. It can deliver power at 60% efficiency via a fuel cell, which can also run in reverse. It can be pumped at similar transfer rates to liquid hydrocarbons, and it burns at a similar temperature to natural gas. That's a lot of advantages. Sadly, hydrogen displays an equally impressive list of disadvantages. It doesn't occur in nature, so it requires energy to separate. Its storage requires compression up to 700 times atmospheric pressure, refrigeration to minus 253 degrees Celsius, or combination with an organic chemical or metal hydride. Complicated. It carries 1/3 of the energy per unit volume of natural gas, whether liquefied or in gaseous form at any given temperature and pressure. Fuel cells and other equipment designed to use hydrogen have many moving parts and require maintenance. If you combust it, it produces nitrous oxides. It can embrittle metal. It escapes through the tiniest leaks and, yes, it really is explosive. Despite this list of obvious disadvantages, hydrogen holds a vice-like grip over the imaginations of techno-optimists. Let's try and understand why. It all started in 1923, when a British scientist, J.B.S. Haldane, predicted an energy system based on, quote, rows of metallic windmills working electric motors, which, in their turn, supply current at very high voltage to great electric mains. Surplus power, he theorized, quote, will be used for the electrolytic decomposition of water into hydrogen and oxygen, which would be liquefied and stored in vast vacuum-jacketed reservoirs, and in times of calm, these gases would be recombined in explosion motors, working dynamos which produce electrical energy once more, or, more probably, in oxidation cells, which is what they call fuel cells back then. Haldane predicted that hydrogen would power industry, transportation, heating, and lighting. Sounds familiar? He said, "Energy will be as cheap in one part of the country as another, so that industry will be greatly decentralized and no smoke or ash will be produced." Before you get too excited about old JBS's vision for a hydrogen economy, you need to know that he also predicted that it would take 400 years before it came about. Climate change, sadly, won't wait until the year 2426. Fast forward to 1970. Lawrence Jones, a nuclear physicist at the University of Michigan, presented a paper entitled "Toward a Liquid Hydrogen Fuel Economy." In it, he noted, quote, "The use of liquid hydrogen as a long-term replacement for hydrocarbon fuel for land and air transportation must be seriously considered as the logical replacement for hydrocarbons in the 21st century." By the mid-1970s, Japan was listing hydrogen as one of 5 focus areas for its Sunshine Project, with a combined budget equivalent to $2.4 billion today, designed to identify ways of supplying the resource-poor country with energy in the aftermath of the first oil shock. The other 4 technologies being solar power, geothermal, coal gasification and liquefaction, and general supporting research. Vestiges of the status afforded to hydrogen in Japan as a saviour technology can still be seen in the continuing support for its fuel cell car program. When oil prices plummeted in the 1980s, however, hydrogen's grip on the public imagination evaporated. But it came roaring back during the technology bubble around the turn of the millennium. Between September 1997 and March 2000, the share price of Ballard Power Systems, standard bearer for hydrogen fuel cells, leapt by 1,000%. Futurist Jeremy Rifkin captured the zeitgeist with his book, The Hydrogen Economy, which many working in clean energy today still remember. What they don't recall is its subtitle, The Creation of the Worldwide Energy Web and the Redistribution of Power on Earth. Rifkin spun a heady cocktail of peak oil, climate change, and dot-com mania into what he called the Worldwide Hydrogen Energy Web, in which, quote, "millions of end users will connect their fuel cells into local, regional, and national hydrogen energy webs and create a new decentralized form of energy production." This was not hydrogen as engineering solution so much as hydrogen as liberation theology. Absurd. That didn't stop The Economist at the time from buying it. Because hydrogen can be made in a geographically distributed fashion by any producer anywhere, no OPEC cartel or would-be successor to it could ever manipulate the supplies or the price. There need never be another war over energy, it pronounced loftily. Sadly, even by the time Rifkin's book hit the stands in late 2002, the dream had begun to sour. Ballard's shares had shed 96% of their peak value. Soon, the nightmares began. Over the next decade, Ballard shares would fall another 93% before hitting their nadir in 2012. Instead of a miraculous ability to redistribute power to the people, one of the main properties of hydrogen turned out to be relieving its backers of their wealth. And so here we are again. Almost all of the major industrial economies in the world once again have either published new hydrogen plans replete with aspirations, goals, and lashings of taxpayer money, or are in the process of doing so. None is as ambitious and lavish as the EU's hydrogen strategy. The EU's Green Deal, which targets a 55% reduction in emissions relative to the 1990 baseline by 2030 and their complete elimination by 2050, and the EU's COVID recovery plan both have at their heart two documents published simultaneously in July of 2020. The EU Strategy for Energy System Integration and the Hydrogen Strategy for a Climate-Neutral Europe. These two documents lay out in considerable detail a sweeping plan for the production and distribution of green hydrogen. You'll remember that's hydrogen electrolyzed from water using renewable energy. The plan is built around an increase of electrolyzer capacity in the EU from its current 60 megawatts to 6 gigawatts by 2024 and to 40 gigawatts by 2030. In case you're not a dyed-in-the-wool energy wonk like me, 1 gigawatt is about the size of a big conventional power station or one of the larger offshore wind farms or solar farms in the desert. These electrolyzers alone are expected to cost between 24 and 42 billion euros. That's 28 to 50 billion dollars. Keeping them fed with renewable energy will require spending yet more, another 220 to 340 billion euros to get 80 to 100 gigawatts of new solar power or wind generation. Then there's 11 billion euros to retrofit half of the existing fossil-based hydrogen plants with carbon capture and storage, and 65 billion euros for hydrogen transport, distribution, storage, and, yes, refueling stations. The total comes to between 320 billion and 458 billion euros. That's 380 billion to $550 billion at current exchange rates. As US Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen once said, "A billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money." Some of that funding will come from the European Green Deal itself, to which the EU has promised 1 trillion euros from its own budget, 2/3 in the form of grants and 1/3 in the form of loans. But this has to cover a lot more than just the hydrogen strategy, most notably energy efficiency. Member states and the private sector will be expected to pitch in too, and late last year, 5 countries had committed to a total of 26 gigawatts out of the 40 gigawatt electrolysis capacity target for 2030. However it ends up being funded, throwing up to $550 billion at green hydrogen over the next decade might seem, let us say, to use the terminology of Yes Minister, courageous. But that's just the beginning. It covers only capital costs and only for production and distribution. It does not include costs on the demand side, which we're going to take a look at in part 2 of this hydrogen mini-series. And it only gets the EU to 2030. The working assumption for EU electrolyzer capacity in 2050, tucked away in footnote 35 of the hydrogen strategy, is no less than 500 gigawatts. To put that in context, the peak electrical load ever recorded in Europe was 546 gigawatts. So delivering the full hydrogen strategy through to 2050 and net zero would mean pretty much doubling Europe's power demand, doubling its power supply, doubling its power distribution capacity, and building a Europe-wide hydrogen pipeline and distribution network. Goldman Sachs breathlessly predicts an addressable market for green hydrogen in Europe worth 2.2 trillion euros per year by 2050. Bank of America extrapolates total global hydrogen-related infrastructure investment of 11 trillion through to 2050. A trillion here, a trillion there, and now we really are talking big money. Now it's time to talk about the economics of hydrogen. Before we do, there are two numbers I want you to bear in mind: $1 and 40 cents. $1 is the amount it currently costs to buy a kilogram of grey hydrogen for an industrial user. So if you can produce clean hydrogen for $1 or less per kilo, you can push grey hydrogen out of the market and eliminate 2% of current global CO2 emissions. The second number, 40 cents, is the price per kilogram you would need to achieve for hydrogen to push natural gas out of heating applications. It turns out that natural gas is just a really cheap way of delivering heat. We'll be talking more about that in part 2 of this two-parter. Now, the EU hydrogen strategy aims to drive down the cost of producing green hydrogen in Europe, currently between 2.5 and 5.5 euros per kilo, to between 1.1 and 2.4 euros per kilo by the year 2030. That should be enough for it to start displacing grey hydrogen in industries subject to a carbon price, even if it doesn't make clean hydrogen fully competitive without the carbon price. Is that a reasonable target? The cost of green hydrogen is driven by four main factors: the cost of renewable electricity, the capacity factor at which plants run, the cost of electrolyzers, and the cost of capital. The cost of renewable electricity, of course, continues to plummet around the world. The best wind and solar plants in the best locations now generate power at around $15 per megawatt hour, and by 2030, we're certainly going to see this drop to $10 per megawatt hour or below. By 2030, there will be large parts of the world benefiting from power at $20 per megawatt hour from wind and solar, around 1/3 the cost of power from any other source. And there's no reason to believe these sorts of costs will not be achieved in sunny and windy parts of Europe. Electrolyzer costs too have been plummeting, with learning rates of just under 20% per doubling of capacity, similar to wind energy. There are still plenty of remaining pathways to reduce costs, and as the industry scales, we will most certainly see electrolyzer costs come down. But there is a wrinkle. The EU hydrogen strategy wants to drive electrolyzers, quote, from 900 euros per kilowatt to 450 euros per kilowatt or less in the period after 2030. Meanwhile, however, leading Chinese manufacturers are already supplying equipment at $200 per kilowatt, as revealed in BloombergNEF's 2019 Economics of Hydrogen Production from Renewable Power. What's going on? Chinese producers benefit from cheaper raw materials and labour, but they've also focused on the more established alkaline electrolyzers. These, conventional wisdom used to say, don't like to ramp up and down to follow peaks and troughs in electricity demand and supply. As a result, the EU, expecting electrolyzers to be powered by variable renewable energy, focused development for the better part of a decade on solid oxide and proton exchange membrane technologies, the latter able to ramp up and down within tenths of a second. These, however, are more expensive than alkaline and are still far behind in scale. And it turns out alkaline electrolyzers can also be designed to load follow, albeit a little slower. Can the EU catch up from this misstep with Chinese electrolyzer costs? Probably not. Can it hit its cost targets without doing so? Also Probably not. One idea that drove the EU's choice of electrolyser technology, and which keeps cropping up, is that of using surplus renewable energy to generate hydrogen. This will turn out to be, on the whole, a complete mirage. It might make sense for an island grid, but not when it comes to a highly connected continent-scale energy system. Here, the only thing that matters is to produce the cheapest green hydrogen possible, or you'll be outcompeted by producers using the lowest cost renewable electricity at high capacity factors, delivering via pipeline. Let's think about what producing hydrogen just using excess wind and solar power actually means. At present, when variable renewables account for around 13% of global electricity, only 1 to 2% of its output has to be curtailed or discarded because it would otherwise overwhelm the grid. Imagine a future with such huge penetration of renewables that curtailment reaches 33%. It's highly unlikely, given the volume of electric vehicles, grid-connected batteries, heat pumps, interconnectors and demand response, all helping to cushion the variability and use every kilowatt hour produced. But it's not entirely impossible. Even with that gargantuan 33% curtailment, wind or solar with levelized costs of $20 per megawatt hour could still profitably be sold at $30 per megawatt hour, half the price of any known alternative. But given that each renewable project only operates part of the time, during the day for solar, during windy conditions for wind, the surplus power that they would produce, even in this scenario, it will be generated during too few hours each year to run an electrolyser economically. What green hydrogen producers will do instead is, yes, take advantage of whatever free surplus power is available, but supplement it by buying renewable power at normal wholesale prices the rest of the time. By doing so, in the best locations in the world, the ones I call renewable energy superpowers, they will be able to achieve a combination of high capacity factors and low clean power prices. While individual renewables plants may operate at a capacity factor of between 15%, that's the low end for solar, to 60%, the high end for offshore wind, if they are co-located or linked via power lines, it will be possible to get very high capacity factors, perhaps 80% or more, given some judicious investment in ever cheaper batteries, and that will enable the production of very cheap green hydrogen. By 2050, therefore, extrapolating long-standing trends in renewable power and electrolyser costs, combining them with the likely ability to run at high capacity factors, and with reductions in cost of capital as financiers master both technology and market risk, BloombergNEF estimates that green hydrogen will be available at between 80 cents and $1 per kilo by 2050, and I would not be surprised to see it go below that. Parts of southern Europe boast that magic combination of low-cost solar and wind resources required to get there, in competition with the renewable energy superpower regions of Australia, Morocco, the Gulf, Mexico, Chile, Brazil, southern US, China, India, and so on. Northern Europe, however, does not, which is why Germany is planning to import both clean electricity and green hydrogen, and why Hydrogen Europe, the umbrella organisation for hydrogen interests in that continent, has proposed a 2x40 plan, the EU strategy's 40 gigawatts of electrolyser capacity by 2030, plus 40 gigawatts more in North Africa and Ukraine. It's also worth noting that green hydrogen based purely on offshore wind is unlikely to be competitive with production based on a combination of super cheap solar and onshore wind. Even by 2050, offshore wind is likely to be at a levelized cost disadvantage, and it also shows strong self-correlation, which means it won't be able to deliver the holy grail of very high capacity factors unless hybridized with solar power. Green hydrogen, based on renewable energy, is not the only possible source of zero-carbon hydrogen. First off, there's blue hydrogen, produced by reforming natural gas or gasifying coal, but with the CO2 emissions captured and stored. The EU hydrogen strategy estimates the current cost of producing blue hydrogen at €2 per kilo, but by 2030 there's no reason why it could not be produced at least as cheaply as the EU's 2030 target for green hydrogen at €1.50 per kilo, given the extraordinary strengths in energy, carbon capture and chemicals of European industry. In the longer term, over a multi-decade period, because it benefits from slower learning rates, blue hydrogen can be expected to fall behind green in the cost stakes. The EU hydrogen strategy admits that blue hydrogen will play a role. As noted, it highlights €11 billion for retrofitting half of existing fossil-based plants. Separately, however, the EU has indicated that it will not provide any of the required funds itself. That will be down to member states or the private sector. Germany is particularly hostile to blue hydrogen, declaring almost as an article of faith in its national hydrogen strategy that only hydrogen produced on the basis of renewable energies is sustainable in the long term. Two legitimate reasons are often cited for reservations about blue hydrogen, and one poor reason. The first real concern is that generally only 90% or less of CO2 is actually captured. This can be increased, but only at additional cost. Though you might think it's sensible for the EU to devote some of the vast funds earmarked for electrolysis research to improving the process. The second real and legitimate concern is the issue of fugitive emissions. Wherever natural gas is extracted, there is some loss to the atmosphere, and methane, the main constituent of natural gas, is a powerful greenhouse gas. Again, it seems odd to regard this as an intractable problem, particularly given the rapid strides in tracking leaks via satellite. Now that miscreants can so easily be caught, the oil and gas industry is rallying around efforts to choke off fugitive emissions. The third, poor reason for not supporting blue hydrogen is simply because its production will benefit oil and gas companies, something many activists find unacceptable. But the idea that we can somehow effect a transition to net zero energy without the involvement of the world's largest energy companies, the companies with most experience in handling explosive gases, moving them around safely, delivering them to customers, is, of course, absurd. Green and blue hydrogen are not the only games in town. Truly zero-carbon hydrogen can also be produced by a pyrolysis process, by which natural gas is passed through a molten alkali or metal, producing carbon black as a byproduct. This turquoise hydrogen process can be powered by clean energy and looks economically promising, though, like blue hydrogen, it's frowned on by purists because it does not eliminate the risk of fugitive emissions or the involvement of oil and gas companies. And hydrogen from biomass is also confusingly often called turquoise hydrogen. Then there's nuclear power, also frowned on by purists, but potentially attractive in generating zero-carbon hydrogen nevertheless. I've written before on the ghastly economics of new nuclear power stations based on current generation technology, but small modular reactors could perhaps turn this around. And nuclear power has two great advantages over renewables for industrial processes like hydrogen production. It likes to run 24/7, and it produces waste heat, which can be used in the hydrogen process. Whether those advantages are enough to counter the likely persistent levelized cost disadvantage of nuclear, as well as the risks that inevitably accompany it, remains to be tested. And tested it should be. One final zero-carbon hydrogen concept that's worth mentioning is the elegant thermal hydrogen approach proposed by thermodynamic engineer Jared Moore. In most plans for hydrogen electrolysis, no value at all is ascribed to the byproduct, oxygen. In this proposed system, however, it takes the place of air during the combustion of natural gas. The resulting hot gases, mainly CO2, are used to drive a special sort of turbine called an Allen cycle turbine. This produces power and heat, as well as delivering a pure stream of CO2 ready for use or storage at far lower cost than can be achieved by separating it from normal exhaust gases. The heat and electricity are in turn used for high-temperature electrolysis, generating entirely clean hydrogen and the oxygen required by the process itself. I told you it was elegant. Now let's talk about transporting hydrogen. Distributing cheap green hydrogen around Europe, the other part of the EU hydrogen strategy, should add between 7 and 50 euro cents per kilogram, according to BloombergNEF, as long as it's done via a pipeline. Start using trucks or ships, whether the hydrogen is gaseous, liquefied, or combined with an organic vector like toluene, and the costs quickly soar to anything from 60 cents to as much as $7 per kilo of hydrogen, depending on volume and distance, rendering it uncompetitive against grey hydrogen and against the EU's target price of 1.1 to 2.4 euros per kilo. Where there are no pipelines, the most viable vector for bulk transportation of hydrogen over long distance looks like being ammonia. But even then, the total transportation cost, including conversion, storage, and so on, could be 3 times the cost of producing the hydrogen in the first place. In September 2020, Saudi Aramco and Japan's Institute of Energy Economics, in collaboration with Saudi chemicals company SABIC, sent the world's first shipment of blue ammonia, that is, ammonia made from natural gas, but with the CO2 captured and stored, from Saudi Arabia to Japan, to be used for generating zero-carbon power. It was only a pilot, but it's hard to see this ever work economically. And of course, if the captured CO2 is used for enhanced oil recovery, the whole thing becomes a self-licking ice cream in terms of emissions. So, in summary, what can we learn from all this, other than the fact that a massive wall of money is about to break over the hydrogen supply side? Will green hydrogen be competitive with blue hydrogen by 2030? Probably. Competitive with grey hydrogen in Europe? Not quite, but perhaps close. Will there be vast amounts of green hydrogen cheaper than grey hydrogen by 2050? Absolutely. Though in Europe, much of it is likely to be imported from places where it can be made more cheaply. And even if it is made in Europe, it may well not be made using European electrolyzers, and certainly not using exclusively European renewable power. Next week, in part 2 of this hydrogen mini-series, we'll be looking at the demand side. Where on earth is all this cheap green hydrogen meant to go? Stay tuned, hydrogen fans! And meanwhile, I'd like to thank BloombergNEF for allowing me to share these thoughts with you on cleaning up.